She fell in love with the only man in the world who could not see her scars, a blind prince. But she never imagined that the cure for his sight would be the death sentence for their love. If stories about the power of acceptance resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. Dust, sun, and the hostile glint of steel. Izha-n'de felt the arid, hot ground under her knees, a circle of worn boots and dusty uniforms closing in around her. The barrels of the rifles were cold, silent mouths, promising a swift end to a life that had barely begun. The heavy air of the Sonoran desert carried the breath of aguardiente from one of the soldiers and the sound of cruel laughter that echoed in her ears. Her first instinct, a reaction as old as the wound itself, was to bring a trembling hand to her face, covering her left cheek. She did not fear death as much as she feared the looks of contempt that would precede it. Under the merciless sun, cornered by men who saw her as nothing but a savage, she gathered what little breath she had left and pleaded, in broken Spanish as fragile as a dry twig, "Please, don't look at me." The silence that followed her plea was more terrifying than the insults. She waited for the blow, the shot, anything to end the agony of being seen, of being judged. Instead, a shadow moved, not with the expected aggression, but with a stillness that cut through the tense air. One of the figures knelt before her, and through the gaps between her fingers, she saw a metal canteen being extended. The gesture was so unexpected her heart skipped a beat. She raised her eyes, finding not mockery, but a young face, marked by the exhaustion of war, whose eyes she could not decipher. Then, a low voice, almost a whisper so that only she could hear, spoke the words that would become the anchor of her existence. "You are all I wish to see." It was an unexpected balm on an open wound, a kindness so out of place in that hell, it felt like a dream. The spell of those words was broken by the sound of spit hitting the ground. "What do you think you're doing, Lieutenant?" snarled one of the soldiers, the same one whose sour breath she had smelled earlier. Kindness was a crime in that place, a weakness to be punished. But the man before her, whose name she did not yet know, rose slowly, his shadow covering her like a shield. He did not turn to face his men. His eyes, a deep brown like wet earth, remained fixed on hers. "This woman is my prisoner," he declared, his voice no longer a whisper, but a sharp command that allowed no argument. "She will come with me. The rest of you, prepare to march." There was a murmur of discontent, but the authority in his posture silenced any rebellion. To Izha-n'de, the word prisoner had never sounded so much like salvation. The forced march that followed was a blur of dust, fear, and the constant presence of the lieutenant by her side. He treated her not as a captive, but as a companion in misfortune, sharing his meager water ration and ensuring the pace was bearable. During a brief rest under the sparse shade of a mesquite tree, he asked her name. "Izha-n'de," she answered, her voice hoarse. He repeated it, the pronunciation stumbling in the foreign tongue, but the effort was a caress. It was in that moment of fragile connection that fate intervened. A deafening explosion tore through the canyon silence, sending earth and rock shrapnel in all directions. The last sound she heard was his shout, and the last thing she saw before being thrown to the ground was his body lunging to protect her. A blinding white flash stole the world. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears subsided, he was no longer there. Only chaos, the smell of gunpowder, and the echo of his words in the desert of her soul. The world returned in fragments of pain and ringing. Izha-n'de pushed herself up on her elbows, the taste of copper and dust in her mouth. The scene around her was a testament to the sudden violence, the bodies of the other soldiers scattered at unnatural angles, the rock blackened and smoking at the epicenter of the blast. But her mind had room for only one unspoken name, for a face that had truly seen her. Desperate, she dragged herself across the gravelly ground, ignoring the cuts on her hands and knees. And then she found him, lying a few meters away, where the force of the blast had thrown him after shielding her. He was alive, his breathing shallow and erratic, but his face, the face that had looked at her with kindness, was covered in blood, a crimson mask where rock shards were cruelly embedded around his eyes. The horror froze the blood in her veins. The man who wished to see her might never be able to again. The survival instinct, sharpened by a lifetime in the arid lands, took over from panic. He had saved her from his men. She would save him from the desert. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she lifted him, the weight of his inert body. Nearly breaking her, ignoring the main path, she plunged into a hidden trail, a secret known only to her people. The sun beat down on her, each step a battle against exhaustion and thirst, but the faint pulse in his neck was the only fuel she needed. She found refuge in a small grotto, hidden behind a curtain of withered cacti. There, in the cool twilight, she tore a strip from her own clothing and, with the precious water left in his canteen, began to clean his face with desperate gentleness. She wiped the blood from his eyelids, feeling the wounds beneath her fingers, and prayed to the ancient spirits that the darkness she cleansed from his skin had not settled forever in his eyes. The days dissolved into a cycle of feverish watchfulness. For Izha-n'de, the world shrank to the dim grotto, the sound of the lieutenant's ragged breathing, and her own silent hunt for roots and what little moisture she could extract from cacti. She kept him alive with the wisdom of her people, forcing broths of bitter herbs between his cracked lips and keeping his wounds clean. On the fourth dawn he moaned, a conscious sound for the first time. His fingers twitched, searching for something in the void. "Water," he murmured, his voice a scratch in his dry throat. She brought the canteen to his lips, and he drank greedily. Then a tremor ran through his body. He tried to open his eyes, and pure anguish contorted his face when he found only darkness. I can't see anything. The light, where is the light?" Her hand found his, holding it with a firmness that belied her own fear. "Be calm," she whispered, her voice a balm in his growing darkness. "There was an explosion. You saved me." He lay still, absorbing the truth in those few words. The memory of the flash, the sound, the pain. He didn't ask about his men. The desert silence outside was the only answer he needed. His other hand rose, hesitant, searching for her face in the dark. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her lip, moving up with a reverent gentleness until they met the rough texture of the scar she always hid. He didn't pull back. Instead, his thumb caressed the mark, not with pity but with a kind of recognition. "Alejandro," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "My name is Alejandro." In that moment, in the silence of the grotto, the man who had truly seen her became blind, and she, the woman who couldn't bear to be seen, became his only eyes. This acceptance born in darkness is proof that true vision comes from the heart. If you also believe in the strength of this new beginning, comment with the word vision to send them your strength. The days that followed were a dance of dependence and trust. The grotto couldn't be a home forever. "I need to take you to my people," she said, the decision heavy in her voice. "They have healers, herbs that might be able to help." The journey was slow and arduous. She became the narrator of his world, describing the deep red of the rocks at sunset, the shape of clouds that promised a rain that never came, the solitary flight of a hawk in the blue sky. For Alejandro, the world transformed into textures and sounds, the roughness of her hand guiding his, the rustle of a lizard on the stones, the wind carrying the scent of dust and sage. He learned to trust every step she indicated, every warning of a root or a loose stone. In his darkness, her voice was the only light, and the scar beneath his fingers, which he often touched, as she slept, was the map of a face he refused to forget. When they finally arrived, the settlement was little more than a handful of adobe dwellings nestled in a hidden canyon crevice. The reception was not warm. People emerged from the shadows, their faces hard and suspicious at the sight of a Mexican soldier's uniform. Spears were raised, and a hostile circle formed around them, a frighteningly familiar image for Izha-n'de. But this time, she didn't flinch. She stood before Alejandro, a human, shield against her own people's fear. "He saved me," she declared, her voice loud and clear, echoing off the stone walls. An older woman with hair as white as salt and eyes that held the wisdom of 100 winters stepped forward. "You bring an enemy to our refuge, Izha-n'de. He wears the colors of those who hunt us." Izha-n'de met the elder's gaze. He wears no colors anymore. The desert stole his sight. Now he only sees what I tell him. The elder, whose name was Yaretse, did not look. Away. Her gaze was like flint, hard and capable of striking sparks. She circled Izha-n'de and approached the blind man. Alejandro, sensing the new presence, stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Izha-n'de's hand rested on his shoulder, a reassuring touch. Yaretse's wrinkled hands, stained with earth and the wisdom of herbs, rose slowly and touched Alejandro's face. She gently parted the wounded eyelids, examining the lifeless eyes beneath. After a silence that weighed upon the entire village, she stepped back. "The darkness has emptied him of his people's venom," she said, her voice resonating with authority. "We will tend to his wounds, but let it be clear, Izha-n'de, if the light returns to these eyes, who can guarantee the soldier will not return with it?" The elder's words were a decree. The spears were lowered, and Alejandro was led into one of the adobe dwellings, the cool interior, a relief from the scorching sun. The weeks that followed were a balm for them both. While Yaretse treated his eyes with herbal poultices that stung and promised, Izha-n'de taught him a new world. He learned to distinguish the smell of ground corn from the aroma of baking mesquite bread. He learned to recognize the light footsteps of children and the weary shuffle of hunters returning at the end of the day. And, more than anything, he learned the map of Izha-n'de's face with his fingertips. The scar that once defined her to the world was, to him, just a familiar texture, a path his fingers followed to find her smile. In that sanctuary of darkness, their love blossomed, pure and unconditional, built on the tacit premise that he would never see her again. Yaretse's question hung in the air for weeks, a ghost in the corner of Izha-n'de's peripheral vision. Their love deepened in the safety of Alejandro's darkness. He never called her by her name, but by Izha-n'de, a word from her language meaning beautiful. He would say it while tracing the scar on her face, not as a flaw, but as a river on a map that always led him home. Izha-n'de allowed herself to flourish under this touch, under this acceptance. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, not despite her mark, but because of everything she was. The irony was cruel. His prison of darkness had become her freedom, and she feared the day the key that freed him would also lock the door to her heart. The day came quietly, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. Yaretse was applying a new paste of mashed leaves to Alejandro's eyes, a daily ritual that had become routine. Izha-n'de held his hand, as she always did. Suddenly, his hand squeezed hers with a sudden force. "Izha-n'de," he gasped, his voice tense. "The light. I think I saw the light." It wasn't vision, but a perception, a vague distinction between total blackness and the shadow of Yaretse moving against the dwelling's entrance. To him, it was the first star in an endless night sky. To Izha-n'de, it was the first flash of lightning before the storm, the first crack in the foundation of her world. A forced smile appeared on her lips as her heart turned to a stone of ice. "That's wonderful, Alejandro," she lied, her voice choked with a joy she did not feel. The progress came with agonizing slowness. Shadows became silhouettes. Silhouettes gained outlines. For Alejandro, each new blur of color was a miracle, a promise that the world was not lost forever. He excitedly described to Izha-n'de, the indistinct shape of the fire in the hearth or the form of a child passing the doorway. Every description was a knife to her heart. She began a silent mourning for the blind man she loved, the man whose hands saw her better than any eyes could. Her touches became hesitant. When his hands rose to explore her face, she would find excuses to pull away, offering him a cup of water or adjusting his blankets. She felt Yaretsi's wise and sad gaze upon her, a silent witness to her growing anguish. The elder's question echoed in every act of healing. Who can guarantee the soldier will not return with it? Finally, the day came when Yaretsi entered the dwelling with a small ceramic pot and an air of finality. She said nothing, but the air grew heavy with anticipation. She removed the bandages and applied one last ointment to Alejandro's eyes. "Keep them closed until the sun sets," she instructed. "The moonlight will be gentler." The wait was the longest of Izha-n'de's life. When night fell, casting a silver glow through the entrance of the dwelling, Alejandro took a deep breath. With a trembling hand, he reached for hers. "Stay where I can see you," he whispered. "You are the first thing I want to see." Primal terror paralyzed her. Slowly, painfully, he opened his eyes. He blinked once, twice, and a gasp escaped his lips. The world was a blur of silver and shadow, but it was the world. His eyes, now alive and focused, found her silhouette. The instant his gaze met hers, instinct took over. She let go of his hand, stood up, and fled into the darkness of the night, leaving behind the echo of her own sob and Alejandro's first clear sight, the fading shape of the woman he loved. "Nijoni!" Alejandro's cry tore through the night, a sound of pure confusion and pain. He tried to stand, but his legs, weakened by weeks of inactivity, gave way. The newfound world spun dizzily, an impressionist painting of moonlight and shadows that made no sense. He leaned against the doorframe, his knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Where did she go?" he asked, his voice hoarse with desperation, to the quiet figure that materialized beside him. Yaretsi placed a firm hand on his arm. Her face, now visible to him as a map of wise wrinkles, was a mask of compassion and sadness. "She did not run from you, soldier," the elder said, her voice as soft as the desert wind. "She ran from your eyes." Alejandro stared at her, and in his mind, the first words she had ever said to him echoed with devastating clarity. "Please, don't look at me." Izha-n'de ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, finding refuge in a rocky alcove she had known since childhood. Huddled in the cold darkness, she hugged her knees, her body racked with silent sobs. He had seen her. That single instant, the focus in his newborn eyes had broken the spell. The love that had blossomed in darkness now seemed a fragile flower, destined to wilt under the first light of day. To her, the man she loved, the man whose fingers knew her soul, had died the moment his eyes opened. What remained was a soldier, a stranger, a man who now knew the ugly truth she carried on her face. Every whisper of Nijoni now felt like a cruel lie, a word that belonged only to the darkness, and the darkness was gone. Yaretsi's words fell on Alejandro like stones. "She ran from your eyes." He looked down at his own hands, the rough, calloused palms that had been his windows to her soul. With them, he had mapped every contour of her face, every curve of her smile, and yes, the raised texture of the scar she hated so much. To him, that mark was not a flaw. It was a river, a path his fingers traced every night, an inseparable part of the woman who had saved him. The beauty he found in her was not born of ignorance, but of the intimacy that darkness had allowed him. His newfound sight was a stranger, an intruder. The real knowledge was in his touch. He turned to the elder, urgency and certainty hardening his expression. "I have to find her," he said, not as a soldier giving an order, but as a man on the verge of losing everything. "I have seen her before, Yaretsi. Now I need her to see me." The elder studied him for a long moment, her piercing gaze weighing the sincerity in his soul. Finally, she nodded, an almost imperceptible gesture. "Fear digs deep burrows," she said, pointing with her chin toward a narrow path that snaked upward, toward the deeper shadows of the canyon. "She is where the light has the most trouble reaching." Leaning on a staff that Yaretsi offered him, Alejandro began the climb. Every step was a battle. The visual world was a chaotic assault of shapes and depths his brain didn't yet know how to decipher, forcing him to rely on muscle memory and the feel of the staff. He found her just as Yaretsi had predicted, nestled in a small cave, a shadow within a shadow. Her figure, hunched over, was a knot of pain. He stopped at the entrance, his heart aching with an empathy that transcended sight. He did not call her Izha-n'de. That word belonged to their sanctuary, and he needed to rebuild it first. Instead, with a choked voice, he whispered her real name, the anchor of his existence. Izha-n'de. The sound of her name made her shrink even further, as if the word were a physical light that could expose her. "Go away," she whispered against her knees, her voice muffled by despair. "You have what you wanted. You have the world back." Alejandro took a hesitant step into the cave's darkness, his body still readjusting to the miracle of sight. Her silhouette was a well of sorrow he felt more than saw. "I don't want the world," he said, his voice firm despite the pain he felt. "I want my world." He stopped a few feet from her, and then he did the only thing that could prove his truth. He closed his eyes. The newfound light was extinguished by his own will, and he plunged back into the familiar, comforting darkness where he had found her. "Here," he whispered to the darkness. "This is where I truly saw you. This is where you were always, Izha-n'de." The silence in the cave was filled by the sound of her stifled sob. With his eyes still closed, he reached out his hand into the void, just as he had done so many times in the village. "I don't know where you are," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I need you to guide me." For a long moment his hand remained suspended in the air. Then, trembling and hesitant, her hand found his. There, fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both a farewell and a greeting. He knelt before her, his other hand rising to find her face. His fingers, the true seers of their story, traced the line of her jaw and moved up to the scar. He didn't pull back. Instead, his thumb caressed the mark with a reverent tenderness. "This is your story. It's the proof that you survived," he said, opening his eyes slowly, allowing the dim light to reveal the tears streaming freely down her face. "And it's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." His words were not a balm. They were a flood, breaking the dam of shame she had held back her entire life. The sob that escaped her was not of sadness, but of a release so overwhelming it left her breathless. She leaned forward, not to hide, but to press her forehead against his, closing her own eyes. In that shared darkness, in that contact that was skin against skin, soul against soul, the scar ceased to be a border that separated her from the world. It was just skin, warmed by his touch, sanctified by his acceptance. For the first time, she was not the woman with the scar. She was just Izha-n'de, and that was enough. She didn't need to be Izha-n'de. She needed to be seen, and he saw her. The descent from the mountain was silent, but every step was a conversation. He held her hand, not out of a need for a guide, but a need for an anchor in this visually overwhelming world. Under the silver glow of the moon, he would stop occasionally, not to rest, but just to look at her. And for the first time, she didn't look away. She held his gaze, allowing him to memorize the truth of her face in the light, just as he had memorized it with his touch in the darkness. When they arrived back at the settlement, Yaretsi was waiting at the entrance, her face impassive. The elder did not look at Alejandro. Her wise eyes were fixed on Izha-n'de. She saw the straight posture, the lifted chin, and the absence of the fear that had always haunted her. She saw Alejandro's hand holding hers with a tender possession, The elder's question had been answered. The light had returned to his eyes, but the soldier had not. The man who returned was even more blind to the world's prejudice than before. The dawn found them in the small dwelling, the timid light painting the adobe in shades of pink and orange. For the first time, Alejandro watched her sleep. He studied the way the morning light softened the scar, transforming it not into a mark of violence, but into a delicate line, as if drawn by an artist. When her eyes opened, they met his, and the panic of the previous night had been replaced by a trembling calm. "Good morning, Izha-n'de," he whispered, testing the word in the light. She did not flinch. Instead, a genuine smile, the first he had ever seen, bloomed on her lips. It was in this comfortable silence that reality knocked on the door. "I can't go back," he said, his voice serious. "To my people. The lieutenant you knew died in that canyon, and he needs to stay dead." Izha-n'de nodded, understanding the weight of that statement. He wasn't just choosing her, he was renouncing an entire world, becoming a ghost to everyone he had ever known. That same day, he stood before Yaretse and the village elders. Izha-n'de was by his side, her hand in his, a silent declaration of unity. Alejandro no longer wore the remnants of his uniform, but a simple tunic he had been given. With a solemnity that surprised everyone, he placed his old uniform on the ground in the center of the circle. "This man is dead," he declared, his voice resonating with unshakable finality. "I do not ask you to accept a soldier. I ask that you teach a man how to live. I will trade my rifle for a plow, my sword for a hunting knife. My only loyalty from this day forward is to this woman, and if you will allow me, to the people who protected her." Yaretse looked at the dusty fabric on the ground, and then raised her eyes to the couple. "Words are wind," she said, though there was a new respect in her voice. "Actions are seeds. Plant yours in this land. We will see what grows." The acceptance was not total, but it was a beginning. The soldier had died so that the man could have a chance to flourish. And so the days of sowing began. The land was a harsher master than any sergeant, and Alejandro's hands, accustomed to the coldness of steel and the precision of a trigger, were clumsy with the hoe. His shoulders, strong enough to carry a rifle for leagues, ached with the effort of digging into the dry, stony soil. He was watched. The children's eyes followed him with unabashed curiosity, the men's with a veiled suspicion. Every drop of sweat, every blister that broke on his palm was a test. Izha-n'de was his shadow and his son, patiently teaching him to read the language of the earth, to know when a plant was thirsty and when the sky promised only more heat. At night, in the quiet of their dwelling, she would tend to his wounded hands. And he, in turn, would trace the scar on her face no longer like a blind man discovering, but like a man reading his favorite poem. The real test, however, came not from the earth, but from the sky. The summer rains did not arrive. The stream that fed the settlement shrank to a muddy trickle, and the crops began to wither under the relentless sun. Tension grew in the village like a weed. The hunters returned empty-handed as the animals had migrated in search of water. It was during a tense meeting of the elders that Alejandro, sitting silently in the corner of the room, finally spoke. "The animals are not gone," he said, his voice calm, but with the authority of one who understands tactics. "They are hiding, using the canyon shadows during the day. If the hunters go out before dawn and corner them from two directions, using the wind to their advantage, they will have nowhere to run." A shocked silence fell. He wasn't suggesting how to hunt. He was describing an ambush. The soldier had not disappeared. He had just changed his target. An older, stern-faced hunter named Mateo spat on the ground. "You want us to use the enemy's tactics? To hunt like a pack of wolves? Like the men who killed our brothers?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Alejandro did not back down. His eyes, which now saw with clarity, met Mateo's without arrogance, only with an honest weariness. "I was taught that knowledge to take lives," he answered, his voice firm. If now it can be. Used to sustain them, to feed your children. Perhaps it is the only form of redemption I have left. He did not look at Izha-n'de, but he felt her hand slide into his, a gesture of unwavering faith. Yaretsi, who had been watching everything in silence, finally spoke, her gaze moving from Alejandro to the hungry faces around her. Hunger is a worse enemy than any memory, she decreed. We will do as he says. Once, in the freezing darkness before dawn, the hunters moved like specters. There was a reluctance in their movements, a mistrust in the way they followed Alejandro's instructions, which he had drawn in the sand with a stick. He did not go with them. He remained at the edge of the village, beside Izha-n'de, watching the torches split into two lines of fire that disappeared into the darkness. The wait was a silent torment, each minute stretching into an eternity. Then the sound came. Not the crack of a rifle, but the hiss of arrows, the thud of falling bodies, and the distant shout of a hunter signaling success. When the sun finally rose, they returned, not empty-handed, but with their shoulders stooped under the weight of 2 deer carcasses. Mateo stopped before Alejandro. He did not smile, but in his tired eyes there was a glint of reluctant respect. He held out an obsidian knife. "The soldier saved the village," he said, his voice low. "Now the man will help us prepare the meat." The obsidian knife was cold and strangely light in his hand, devoid of the deadly familiarity of a military dagger. Alejandro accepted it with a nod, joining the circle of squatting men. The smell of hot blood and musk hung in the air. His first attempts at skinning were clumsy, tearing the flesh where a clean cut should have been. Mateo, without a word, gestured with his own knife, showing the correct angle, the pressure to apply. It was not a gesture of friendship, but of an impatient master with a slow apprentice. Alejandro obeyed, focusing on the task, on the work of his hands. This was a different kind of violence, a violence that nourished. With each precise cut, he felt as if he were dismembering not just the animal, but the soldier within himself, separating the useful instincts from the murderous intent. In the distance, Izha-n'de watched. The circle of men was no longer a threat. It was a workshop, and the man she loved was being patiently remade within it. That night, the village gathered around a large bonfire, and the aroma of roasted meat replaced the smell of dust and despair that had lingered for weeks. The music of a clay flute danced in the air, and the children's laughter sounded louder than ever. Alejandro and Izha-n'de sat slightly apart, but no one treated them like outcasts anymore. A plate of food was offered to them, and a shy girl handed him a warm cornbread before running away, laughing. The acceptance was palpable, but as the celebration wound down and they retreated to the quiet of their dwelling, Izha-n'de felt a tension in his shoulders. "What is it?" she whispered, tracing the line of his jaw. He took a long time to answer, his eyes fixed on the shadows dancing on the wall. "It was too easy, Nijoni," he said, his voice low and haunted. "That way of thinking, in flanks, traps, weak points. The soldier woke up without me calling him. Today, he gave us food. But what about tomorrow? I'm afraid of the man who lives inside me, the one you never knew." Izha-n'de didn't pull away. Instead, she moved closer, her small, warm hand covering his. She waited until his haunted eyes met hers in the dim light. "I didn't know the soldier," she said softly, each word a carefully placed truth. "But I know the man who commands him, the man who closed his eyes to see me. That knowledge is not a monster, Alejandro. It's a tool. Today, you used it to give us life. The choice was yours, not the soldier's. That man from the past gave you the strength to survive in the desert. This man, the one here with me, chooses to use that strength to protect." She raised her other hand and touched his temple, where a small scar from his old life was still visible. "I have my marks. You have yours. They don't define us. They just tell us where we came from. The peace her words brought deepened in the weeks that followed. The rains finally came, a blessing that washed the dust from the land and from the village's soul. The fields, which Alejandro had helped to plow, turned a vibrant green. His acceptance was no longer reluctant. It had become part of the community's fabric. Mateo, the hunter, began to seek him out, not just to plan hunts, but to discuss the best patrol routes to watch the territory's borders, merging the ancient knowledge of the trails with Alejandro's tactical cunning. He was no longer a soldier or a foreigner. He was the guardian of the trails, the man who saw dangers others did not. He found a way to bury the soldier, not through forgetting, but by transforming his darkest instincts into a shield for the people who had become his family. A year passed, marked by the cycle of harvests and the deepening of the roots Alejandro was putting down in this land. Peace was a tangible thing, felt in the routine of working under the sun and in the sound of Izha-n'de's breathing beside him at night. But the peace of the desert is always fragile. It was broken not by a shout, but by the hurried arrival of one of the young hunters Alejandro had been training. The boy stopped before them, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with dread. "Men with the sun on their shoulders," he gasped. "Many of them. They're coming from the east, following the dry riverbed." Alejandro, who was mending a fence, froze. The sun on their shoulders. Officer insignias. He didn't need to ask more. He looked at Izha-n'de, and in her face he saw the reflection of the fear that chilled his own blood. The world he had abandoned had finally come to collect its debt. The news spread like wildfire, and fear gripped the village. Murmurs arose, frightened glances turned toward Alejandro, the catalyst of this threat. But before suspicion could blossom, Mateo stood beside him, his hand on the hilt of his knife. "Do they know these lands?" the hunter asked, his voice grave. Alejandro shook his head. "Not like we do, but they are methodical. They will search every canyon. They are not here by chance. They are hunting me." He turned to face the faces of his new people, his expression hard and resigned. "You don't have to die for me. If you hand me over, the life of a deserter might be enough for them." It was Izha-n'de who answered, her voice clear and unwavering for all to hear. "They are looking for a lieutenant. That man died in the desert. Here there is only a guardian of the trails." She took his hand, and the gesture silenced all fear. Before her faith, Alejandro lifted his chin. The choice was made. He would not run. He turned to Mateo. "Gather the hunters. The soldier will teach them how to defend a home." The night was not for sleeping, but for preparing for war. Around a map drawn in the sand by the light of a single torch, the soldier in Alejandro resurfaced, but with a different heart. He did not teach the hunters to fight. He taught them to become ghosts. "We don't fight them. We fight their morale," he explained, his voice low and intense, moving stones that represented the enemy soldiers. "We are the wind that puts out their fires. We are the echo of a scream where there is no one. We will use every crevice, every goat trail, every shadow. They will not find an army. They will find a haunted desert that wants to drive them out." Mateo and the other men listened, their initial suspicion replaced by a grim understanding. Izha-n'de, beside him, pointed to the sand map, her nail tracing paths that not even the most experienced hunters knew, escape routes, hiding places for the women and children. She was the living memory of the land, and he was the strategist, who would make it bleed only as much as necessary. Before dawn, the village was empty, an abandoned cocoon. The women, children, and elders had disappeared into the mountain's bowels, led by Izha-n'de to a safe cave before she returned to stand by Alejandro's side. He and the hunters positioned themselves on the canyon's high ground, shadows among the rocks. When the first rays of sun touched the peaks, they arrived. A column of dust that resolved into a dozen uniforms, moving with a disciplined efficiency that made Alejandro's stomach churn. In front, leading them, was a man whose posture he would recognize even in his former darkness, Captain Rivera, his old mentor, the man who had taught him that a deserter was a dishonor to be erased with blood. For a moment, Alejandro faltered. Then he felt Izha-n'de's hand on his arm, a touch that anchored him to the present. He raised his hand, not in greeting but like a silent conductor. In response, Mateo, on the other side of the canyon, pushed a wooden beam. A cascade of stones and rocks tumbled down, not on the soldiers but blocking the passage behind them with a deafening roar. They were no longer hunting. They were caught in the trap. Panic among the soldiers was immediate, a murmur of fear that Captain Rivera silenced with a single icy glare. He did not look at the avalanche that had trapped them, but at the rocks above, his experienced face reading the tactic as if it were a page from a manual. "Hold formation! Eyes open!" he bellowed. An arrow hissed from above, embedding itself in the dust inches from his boot. It was not a miss, it was a message, a demonstration of precision and restraint. Rivera smiled, a humorless smile. He knew that signature, the combination of boldness and control. He raised his voice, and the canyon carried it like a stone megaphone. "Lieutenant Alejandro Vargas, I know it's you. Stop hiding behind savages and face your judgment like a man." The title, Lieutenant, hit Alejandro like a physical blow, an attempt to drag him back into a grave from which he had escaped. For an instant, the soldier within him wanted to answer his superior's call, but Izha-n'de's hand squeezed his, as firm as the rock they hid behind. That touch was everything. He took a deep breath, not the thin air of a cornered soldier, but the familiar air of his home. When he spoke, his voice did not come from a single point, but seemed to echo from all directions, amplified by the canyon walls, the voice of the very ghost he had promised to become. "Lieutenant Vargas died in this desert, Captain." The voice resonated, calm and deadly. "Here, there are only men protecting their families. Leave your weapons, and the desert will let you leave. That is the only mercy you will find here. The courage to abandon who you were to fight for who you have become is the final test of your love. To discover the outcome of this battle for identity and for home, subscribe and join us in the next chapter. Thank you so much for your attention. We'll see you for the conclusion.